In gaming, there are a lot of different genres, and among those genres there are some games that showcase the absolute best that genre has to offer. For a lot of genres, those kinds of games are pretty cut and dried. Platformers, puzzlers, first-person shooters, all of those have pretty easy picks. But in fighting games, how do you choose just one? There are a lot of examples. You got Street Fighter 2, Mortal Kombat, Marvel, Tekken 3, Guilty Gear, Smash Brothers, KOF, Soul Calibur, Shrek Super Slam. The list goes on. But one game that took a long time to gain the public attention it deserves was Street Fighter 3, or more specifically, its third iteration, Third Strike. It's now considered among the best fighting games ever made, but it was released with nowhere near that level of positivity or enthusiasm. Still today, not many people go in-depth on what makes Third Strike so effective, so I figured I may as well fill that void. Bear in mind, this isn't really gonna have a critical point or a larger idea. I'm more interested in laying out Street Fighter 3's history, context, and the quality of its content. Consider this an in-depth look into the things that make the game so special, and why most of those things had a hand in the game's strange reception. First though, some light history. Our story begins with Street Fighter 2. When you hear the words fighting game, even if you don't actively play games, this is most likely what you imagine. Released originally in 1991, Street Fighter 2 embodies the quintessence of 90s arcade games. Its characters, sprites, and even voice clips, compressed as they may be, are instantly recognizable. It set the standard for the entire fighting game genre, and like with any trendsetter, it needed a follow-up. To fill time while waiting for development of a new arcade system, Capcom released Street Fighter Alpha Warrior's Dreams in 1995, and followed it up the next year with Alpha 2. The concept of the Alpha games is that they would take place between the first two Street Fighter games, pulling characters from both, as well as a few newcomers, to fill in the story with a distinctly more energized, anime-inspired tone. The Alpha series would turn out quite successful unto itself, with Alpha 2 being quickly picked up by the ever-growing competitive scene, which in many respects was still in its infancy. Despite all this success, the Alpha series was not quite what Capcom had in mind for a true sequel. That sequel wouldn't come out until 1997 with the release of Street Fighter 3: The New Generation. This would be followed up by Second Impact later the same year, ending with Third Strike: Fight for the Future in '99. At the time, disappointing sales and a lacking player base marked the game as a failure, with a lot of players, myself included, not being aware of the game or its mechanics until witnessing the Daigo parry, often seen as one of the most famous fighting game moments of all time. As I've hopefully made clear by now though, there's a lot more to Street Fighter 3 than just that initial reading. The sheer technical craft and artistry of the game puts it leagues above its contemporaries, and I think now that I've set up the context, it's time to unpack why.
Fighters ready. Engage!
Almost everything about Third Strike's differences in creative goals compared to the rest of the series can be gleaned as soon as its character select screen. Whereas in other Street Fighter games you would be hearing generic, action-y, sort of kung fu music, Third Strike hits the player curiously with rap, of all things. To add to the feeling of being out of one's element, where other previous character select screens would start off by highlighting Ryu, who is, for all intents and purposes, the main character of the series, Third Strike starts off with the cursor on Alex, one of the newer faces. On top of that, the four returning Street Fighter 2 characters, Ryu, Ken, Chun-Li, and Akuma, are spread out to completely different parts of the roster screen, meaning you have to run through the newcomers before finding them. These are small details, but they send a powerful message. We know you're used to these characters, but why not try something new instead? The new characters themselves are amazingly well-designed and inventive takes on different playstyles. The aforementioned Alex is a New York wrestler, someone who fits squarely within the grappler archetype, that of a large muscle man whose playstyle revolves largely around grabs and intimidation. Street Fighter II's version of this took the form of Zangief, who was powerful to be sure but also slow and unwieldy. The few special moves he had were essentially all different grabs and were quite difficult to pull off. In contrast, Alex sets himself apart by being fairly light on his feet and having charge abilities that afford him a defensive edge usually unexpected of his archetype.
I don't lose.
Another good example of Third Strike's laser-focused design can be shown with Makoto, who is best described as Rushdown, a type of fighting game character meant to be played offensively at all times, not too dissimilar to the grappler. Street Fighter II, as far as I can tell, sort of had its own Rushdown character in the form of Cammy, but Makoto is different in how she pushes the archetype to its most extreme. To put it bluntly, her defensive options are hot garbage. Her basic walking speed is pitifully slow, her backdash is all kinds of useless, and she has absolutely no projectiles. On the other hand, her forward dash travels great distances supremely fast, and all of her special moves are defined or enhanced by forward movement. In this case, a familiar archetype isn't just being approached from a different angle, but redefined with greater clarity and specificity. This isn't Third Strike's only method of readdressing older characters and gameplay styles, though. A decent portion of the roster can be described as unlikely but interesting combinations of Street Fighter II characters. On one hand, this could be seen as a strange sort of consolation for longtime fans, but it's also just plain smart game design. Take pre-existing yet disparate moves or ideas and mash them together to find interesting combinations. This willingness for experimentation helps make a smallish roster much more interesting.
Into the heat of battle. Go for it.
It would be wrong of me, though, to talk so much about Street Fighter III's game design successes without also bringing up parrying. In Street Fighter III, any attack can be parried by pressing forward for a medium or high attack, or down for a low attack, just before the opponent's move hits you. Doing this properly means you take no damage, partially fill your super meter, and leave your opponent slightly open for a counterattack. Blocking incoming attacks is still an option, but most of those attacks will still do small amounts of damage, so it is always more beneficial to parry instead. This may at first seem like just a weird gimmick to try and shake things up, but its consequences are far-reaching and ultimately positive. It's an element to the game that's easy to learn but insanely difficult to master, and because of that, and the fact that any attack can be parried one way or another, Street Fighter III's skill ceiling remains miles higher than most of its competition. Looking at it now, over 20 years after its release, it's likely that the game owes its resurgence in popularity to the parrying mechanic. I mentioned the Daigo parry earlier, and I think it's fair to explain what it was for those who are unfamiliar. At EVO 2004, two of the greatest Street Fighter players were facing off for the first time in the losers bracket. Daigo Umehara, who chose Ken, and Justin Wong, who chose Chun-Li. Justin had Daigo down to a mere pixel of health and chose to dramatically end the match with a super art combo. Daigo, knowing that trying to block the super would kill him, was faced with an ultimatum: parry every single hit of Chun-Li's super or get KO'd. The rest speaks for itself. While Third Strike would be saved by that moment, and remembered by series fans as one of the best gameplay-wise, the game was also elevated greatly by its presentation, and it would be remiss for me to not draw at least some attention to it. The CP System 3 that the game utilizes affords it bigger, higher quality sprites, clearer sound, and extremely lush animation with much higher frame counts than previous Street Fighter games. These attributes are not wasted. each character can be understood and interpreted clearly through their movement and expressions, which is critically important for a game almost devoid of story such as this. Here are some good examples. Elena's various animations, especially her idol and her victory bits, are loose, flowing, and carefree. Makoto's voice and attacks show her to be extremely aggressive and serious. Almost every move can be defined by her rigid posture and vocal exclamations.
You win.
Hugo's massive frame is made even more intimidating by how he stumbles forward as though he's struggling to keep his balance. I could keep going. Each and every character has fun animations, poses, and expressions to pick apart, and all of that is enhanced further by the jazzy, laid-back music and the nicely rendered stages. As far as I'm concerned, Street Fighter III is Capcom's audiovisual high point. I don't think it can be topped. All of this praise begs the question, why did Street Fighter III bomb so hard? The short answer is unfamiliarity. Street Fighter II's cast had become so popular and well received that to ditch most of it in favor of a bunch of oddballs was a really tough sell, especially during the infancy of the internet, where the concept of individual trailers for each newcomer was unthinkable. The release of Street Fighter Alpha 3 in '98, which was a year before Third Strike, didn't help matters either, with a roster pretty evenly split between series veterans and relative newcomers, with isms and controls more similar to 2. In an arcade setting, where money and pride were on the line, people stuck to what they knew. The next mainline entry into the Street Fighter lineage wouldn't be until nearly a decade later with Street Fighter IV, which would ironically, I think, become the best summation of Street Fighter III's legacy. The roster ballooned in size, consistently almost entirely of series veterans with only a small handful of newcomers. Parrying was removed completely, and the game overall was designed to be slower and more defensive. Its success essentially brought fighting games back from the same grave Street Fighter III helped deliver it to, and the message was loud and clear. Classic Street Fighter was back. Admittedly, I really like Street Fighter IV, but it's hard to ignore what was lost. Barring a couple of online-friendly re-releases, Street Fighter III and its various iterations have been largely forgotten by Capcom. It's developed a strong cult following, but otherwise it hasn't developed the same instantly recognizable mainstream appeal that the rest of the series has. I see this as a valuable lesson in media. Sometimes the best a genre has to offer isn't something you'll find in a museum, on the pages of a magazine, or given mention on a top 10 list. We live in an interesting time where information on just about any game is always at our fingertips, a privilege that would no doubt have saved many an underappreciated masterpiece in the 80s and 90s. So I figured it would be best to take a moment for a game you might not have heard about today. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for your time.
We await your return, warrior.